Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 6 deeply disturbing stories from the rural farmlands of Kansas. These are tales of people who thought they knew their own land, only to discover something ancient and wrong had been living alongside them all along. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. My uncle's farm sat about 40 minutes northwest of Salina, right where the land starts getting serious about being flat. 300 acres of wheat and sorghum, a white farmhouse that needed paint, and a machine shed bigger than most people's homes. I inherited the place when Uncle Gerald passed in March of 2019. Took me until July to work up the nerve to actually stay there overnight. It wasn't that I had bad memories of the place. I'd spent summers there as a kid, helping with harvest, learning to drive the tractor in slow circles around the south field. But Gerald had lived alone for the last 20 years of his life, and the house had that particular kind of silence that comes from one person eating breakfast at the same table for 2 decades. Everything felt preserved, like he just stepped out to check the equipment and would be back any minute. I drove out on a Thursday. I think it was a Thursday. Might have been a Wednesday. The lease on my apartment in Wichita was up at the end of the month, and I needed to figure out if I was actually going to keep the farm or sell it. The real estate agent kept calling, telling me the land alone was worth decent money, but something made me want to see it through at least one season. I got there around 4 in the afternoon. The house was stuffy, so I opened all the windows on the ground floor and made myself a sandwich with supplies I'd brought from town. The bread tasted stale even though I just bought it that morning. I ate standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at the machine shed. The big sliding door was open maybe 2 feet, and I couldn't remember if Gerald always left it that way or if the wind had pushed it. After I finished eating, I walked out to close it properly. The shed smelled like diesel and old canvas. Gerald's equipment was all still there. The combine, the grain auger, the Ford tractor with the patched seat. I pulled the door shut and latched it, and that's when I noticed the other door. It was set into the concrete floor in the back corner behind a stack of fuel barrels. A wooden door, maybe 3 feet square with an iron ring for a handle. I'd been in this shed 100 times growing up and I'd never seen it before. But then again, those fuel barrels had always been in that corner. Maybe Gerald had moved them before he died. I stood there looking at it for a while. Part of me wanted to just leave it alone, but a bigger part couldn't stop wondering what would be under a farm equipment shed. Root cellar, probably. Somewhere to store potatoes or canned goods back when people did that sort of thing. I pulled 2 of the barrels out of the way and grabbed the iron ring. The door was heavier than it looked, and the hinges screamed when I hauled it open. Underneath was a ladder made of rebar, welded to the concrete shaft. It dropped down into darkness that my phone's flashlight couldn't quite reach the bottom of. I told myself I'd just climb down and take a quick look. I'm not sure why that seemed important, but it did. The ladder went down about 12 feet. At the bottom was a tunnel, not a root cellar like I'd expected, but an actual tunnel with earthen walls held up by wooden supports. It was maybe 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide, running in the direction of the house. The air down there tasted like mud and something else, something sour and organic that made me breathe through my mouth. I followed the tunnel about 30 feet before I found a room. It opened up into a space maybe 10 feet across. The walls were dirt, but someone had smoothed them carefully, almost lovingly. And covering every inch of those walls were photographs. Hundreds of them tacked up with rusty nails. I moved closer with my phone's light. They were all pictures of the farmhouse, taken from different angles and different distances. Some from the road, some from the fields, some from what must have been right outside the windows, close enough that you could see through the glass into the rooms inside. The dates written on the backs went back 40 years. My mouth went dry. Gerald had lived alone here for 20 years. These photos started long before that. And then I saw the ones of me. Me at 12 years old, helping Gerald load hay bales. Me at 15, sitting on the porch steps eating watermelon. Me 2 months ago, standing in this exact machine shed during my first visit after the funeral. All taken from angles that meant someone had been watching. Someone had been close enough to capture the expression on my face. That's when I heard the sound above me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the concrete floor of the machine shed. I switched off my phone's light and pressed myself against the earthen wall. The photographs crinkled under my shoulder blades. The footsteps stopped directly above the open hatch, and I could hear breathing. Not heavy, not labored, just calm, patient breathing. Then a voice drifted down. It was Gerald's voice. Exactly his voice, the slight rasp he'd had from 40 years of smoking. "I know you found it, kiddo. Come on up now." I hadn't heard anyone call me kiddo since Gerald's funeral, and Gerald was 4 months dead. The breathing continued, steady, waiting. I stayed frozen against that wall for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes. The breathing never changed rhythm, never got impatient, just waited. Finally, I heard the footsteps move away back toward the shed's main door. I heard the big sliding door open and close. Then silence. I waited another 5 minutes before I moved. When I finally climbed that ladder, I came up fast, expecting something to be waiting at the top. But the shed was empty. The main door was closed and latched from the inside. I ran to my truck and didn't stop driving until I hit the Salina city limits. I called the sheriff's department the next morning, told them someone might be squatting on my property. 2 deputies went out there and checked everything. They found the tunnel and the photographs. They told me it looked like someone had been living down there on and off for years, maybe decades. Camping gear, old food containers, a sleeping bag that was half rotted. But what they didn't find was any sign of anyone being there recently. No fresh food, no recent tracks. The deputies figured whoever it was had probably been gone for months, maybe since before Gerald died. I didn't tell them about the photographs of me from 2 months ago. I'd left my phone down there in my panic, and I wasn't about to go back for it. I sold the farm to a developer in August. Last I heard, they're putting up a housing development, one of those places with a golf course and a man-made pond. They filled in the tunnel with concrete before they broke ground on the first house. Sometimes I still hear that voice, usually right before I fall asleep. "Come on up now, kiddo." Always patient, always waiting. And 6 months after I sold the place, I found a photograph in my mailbox. No envelope, no postage. Just a photograph of me standing in my new apartment, taken through the living room window. The date written on the back was from the day before. A story 2. The Brewster farm had been in Carla's family since 1889. She inherited it from her grandmother in 2017, and by the time she asked me to help her sort through the old barn that November, She'd already decided to sell. We'd been friends since high school, and I was between jobs, so driving out to help her clean seemed like an easy way to make a few $100. The barn was the old kind, 2 stories tall with a hay loft that hadn't been used in probably 30 years. The main floor was packed with the accumulated debris of 4 generations, broken furniture, boxes of receipts and letters, rusted tools, milk cans, license plates nailed to the walls as decorations. Carla's plan was to have an estate sale for anything valuable and junk the rest. Grandmother always said not to go up into the loft, Carla told me while we were hauling out a dresser with 3 missing drawers. She said the floor wasn't safe. We were making pretty good progress when I found the footlocker. It was shoved back behind a workbench, covered in dust thick enough to write your name in. The lock was broken, and when I opened it, I found it was full of notebooks. The handwritten kind with marbled black and white covers. Maybe 20 of them, all filled with the same cramped handwriting. I pulled one out and flipped it open. It was dated 1934, and the entries were like diary entries but strange. Times and locations mostly. 2:47 a.m. North Pasture Fence Line. 4:15 a.m. Machine Shed Door. 11:32 p.m. Kitchen Window. Carla came over to look. "That's my great-grandfather's handwriting," she said. "William Brewster. He died before I was born." We sat there in the barn's dusty light going through the notebooks. They were all the same, decades of entries, all times and locations. Sometimes there were brief notes. It was closer tonight. I could hear it breathing. It knows I'm watching. The entries went all the way up to 1956. The last one just said, "I can't anymore," and then the page was torn. "This is creepy as hell," Carla said. She was trying to laugh, but her voice had gotten tighter. What was he watching for? I noticed something else then. There was one more item in the footlocker underneath all the notebooks. A revolver, old and heavy, with 5 empty chambers. We decided to call it a day. Carla wanted to take the notebooks to her parents, see if they knew anything about it. We loaded them into her car, and I helped her close up the barn. The sun was getting low, and the temperature had dropped fast the way it does in Kansas in November. "You coming back tomorrow?" Carla asked as we walked to our cars. "Yeah, I'll be here around 9. I watched her drive away, and I was about to get in my truck when I realized I'd left my jacket in the barn. I jogged back, unlocked the side door, and stepped inside. It was darker than I expected. The sun had dropped behind the tree line, and the barn's interior had gone from dim to nearly black. I switched on my phone's flashlight and made my way back to where we'd been working. That's when I heard the sound from the loft. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor. I pointed my light up toward the loft opening. The beam didn't reach far enough to show anything but darkness and the edge of the old hay crane. "Carla." I called out, even though I'd watched her drive away 5 minutes ago. The dragging sound stopped. I should have left then. Every part of my brain was screaming at me to walk out that door and get in my truck. But instead I heard myself say, "Is someone up there?" For a long moment, nothing. Then a voice drifted down from the loft. "William." It was an old woman's voice, thin and wavering. "William, is that you?" My grandmother had died when I was 16, but I recognized her voice instantly. "We've been waiting for you, William. Why don't you come up?" My feet had started moving backward toward the door before I'd consciously decided to run. The voice continued, patient and sweet, exactly the way my grandmother used to sound when she was trying to coax me to finish my dinner. "Don't you want to see us, William? We've missed you so much." I made it to the door and out into the November twilight. I could still hear the voice calling from inside, muffled now by the walls but still clear, still patient. I called Carla from my truck, told her I wasn't coming back tomorrow, told her she should hire someone else to clean out that barn. I didn't explain why, and she didn't push. She had the barn demolished in December. Hired a crew that tore it down in 2 days and hauled everything to the landfill, all of it. Didn't even bother with the estate sale. I ran into her father at the hardware store a few months later. I asked if she'd ever mentioned what I'd heard that night. He gave me this long look and then said, "William Brewster shot himself in that loft in 1956. Carla's grandmother found him hanging from the hay crane. She's the one who told everyone the floor wasn't safe." He paid for his purchase and started to leave, then turned back. William had 3 daughters. They all died young. Influenza, all 3 of them within 2 weeks of each other. That was in 1934, right around when those notebooks started. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. But sometimes late at night when I'm falling asleep, I still hear that voice. Not my grandmother's anymore. Different voices, calling a name that isn't mine, asking me to come up, asking me to stay. Story 3. I was doing farmhand work the summer I turned 23, moving from property to property in Rooks County, helping with whatever needed doing. Fence repair mostly, and some equipment maintenance. The pay was decent and I liked being outside. This was back in 2014, maybe 2015. Jonas Pritchard hired me for a week to help re-roof his old granary. It was a deteriorating concrete building he'd been meaning to fix for years, sitting about a quarter-mile from his house in the middle of a wheat field. The wheat had been harvested already, so it was just me and him and this concrete cylinder with a cone-shaped metal roof that had rusted through in 3 places. Jonas was probably 60, the kind of guy who didn't talk much but worked steady. We spent the first 2 days tearing off the old roof panels. Hot work, even with the wind blowing across the fields. On the 3rd day, Jonas told me we needed to check the interior before we put the new roof on. Make sure the walls weren't cracked, that the rain damage hadn't been too bad. The granary hadn't been used to store anything in decades, he said. His father had stopped farming wheat back in the 80s. There was only one door, a heavy metal thing with a wheel lock like something you'd see on a ship. Jonas had to put his whole body weight into turning it. When it finally opened, air rushed out that smelled like stale grain and something else. Something that made me think of roadkill that had been sitting in the sun. "Jesus," Jonas muttered. He propped the door open with a chunk of concrete and we stepped inside. The interior was one big circular room, maybe 20 feet across. The floor was concrete, covered in a layer of dried wheat husks and dust. The walls curved up to a point about 30 feet above our heads, where light came through the holes in the roof we'd made. And scratched into every inch of those walls from floor to about 8 feet up were words. Not carved, scratched. Like someone had used their fingernails to dig into the concrete over and over, wearing grooves deep enough to be legible. The same words repeated thousands of times, spiraling around the room. "Let me out, let me out, let me out." Jonah stood there for a long time, not saying anything. I watched his jaw work like he was chewing on something tough. "My father built this in 1962, he finally said. His voice sounded strange, flatter than usual. "Helped him pour the concrete myself. I was 10. The scratching was densest near the door, layered so thick the words overlapped into an almost solid patch of scored concrete. I crouched down to look closer. Some of the grooves had dark stains in them, rusty brown. "We should probably call someone," I said. I didn't know who. "The police. The Historical Society." "He never mentioned locking anyone in here," Jonas said. "He wasn't talking to me. Never said a word about it." I walked the perimeter slowly, following the spiral of words. They went around and around, always the same 3 words, always the same desperate scratching. About halfway around the room, I found where they stopped. There was a dark stain on the concrete floor, roughly human-shaped, and lying in the center of it was a pile of rags that, when I looked closer, had the shapes of bones still inside them. "Mr. Pritchard," I said. My voice came out higher than I intended. "There's something over here." He came over and looked down at it. We stood there in the shaft of sunlight from the roof holes, staring at what was left. "We need to leave," Jonas said. "Now." We walked out of that granary, and he sealed the door behind us. He paid me for the full week and told me not to come back. Said he'd handle the rest himself. I found out later he'd sold the property within a month. Sold it to a company that tore down all the structures and turned it into wind farm land. I looked it up online once. There's a turbine now standing right where that granary used to be. But here's the thing that kept me up for months afterward. Before we left that day, while Jonas was sealing the door, I looked back at the wheat fields surrounding the granary. The stubble was all uniform, cut to the same height, the same golden color, except for one patch. Maybe 15 feet from the granary door, there was a perfect circle of wheat stubble that was darker, not just darker, blackened. Like something had scorched it from underneath. And in the center of that circle, someone had arranged the cut stalks into words. "I heard you." The letters were 5 feet tall, precise and deliberate. Jonas saw me staring at it, and I watched all the color drain from his face. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said. "We left. I never did farmhand work in Rooks County again. Moved down to Pratt the next month and found work at a feed store." I heard Jonas died of a heart attack in 2018, 3 years after he sold that property. Sometimes I wonder if he ever told anyone what his father had done. If he ever figured out who'd been locked in there, or how long they'd survived, scratching at the walls until their fingers bled and their voice gave out. But mostly, I wonder about those words in the field, because the wheat had already been harvested. Those stalks had been cut and baled and hauled away weeks before Jonas hired me. There shouldn't have been anything left to arrange. The story 4. My sister Bate bought the old Kowalski property in 2016, 30 acres of scrubland southeast of Hayes. She wanted to start a small goat farm, one of those sustainable agriculture projects that was trendy at the time. The property was cheap because it was mostly useless, rocky soil, a house trailer that needed work, and a storm cellar from the 1950s that everyone agreed was a death trap waiting to happen. I helped her move in that April. She was excited, talking about breeds of goats and hay suppliers, and how she was going to sell artisan cheese at the farmer's market. I was happy for her, even if I thought the whole plan was maybe 60% optimism and 40% delusion. The storm cellar was set into a low hill about 50 yards from the trailer, the kind with slanted wooden doors you had to pull open from the outside. Bate wanted to use it for storage, maybe put in some shelving for her cheese-making supplies. We opened it up on her second day there. The doors were heavier than they looked, swollen from years of rain. When we finally hauled them open, a smell rolled out that was cold and mineral and raw. "That's been sealed for a while," Bate said. She was breathing through her sleeve. The stairs went down about 10 feet to a concrete room, maybe 8 by 10. It was empty except for an old wooden bench along one wall and some rusted chains bolted to the floor in the center. "What the hell were those for?" Bate said, pointing at the chains. I didn't have an answer. They were the kind of chains you'd use to secure something heavy, with big iron links and a padlock that had rusted solid. They were arranged in a pattern, 4 of them, forming a square about 6 feet across. Previous owner probably chained down equipment during storms, I said, but I didn't believe it even as I said it. Bate wanted to clean it out, make it usable. We hauled out the bench, swept out the accumulated dirt and leaves that had blown in through cracks in the doors. The chains we left alone. They were too rusted to move, and Bate figured she could work around them. It was when we were sweeping that I found the scratches. They were on the walls, thin lines gouged into the concrete. Not words like you might expect, just lines. Hundreds of them clustered in groups of 5, tally marks. I counted one section, 37 groups of 5. 185 days. Someone was keeping track of something, Bate said. She'd gone very quiet. We found them on all 4 walls, thousands of marks, years worth. I wanted Bate to fill the thing in with concrete right then. Something about those marks made my skin crawl, but Bate said she'd think about it, and we went back to the trailer for lunch. That night, I slept on her couch. She'd gotten most of her furniture moved in, and the trailer was starting to feel lived in. I was almost asleep when I heard her scream. I ran to her bedroom and found her standing at the window, pointing outside. She was shaking. "Someone's at the cellar," she said. I looked. In the moonlight, I could see the cellar doors were open, and standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long coat. It stood perfectly still, silhouetted against the pale grass. I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff's department. While I was on with dispatch, Bate and I watched the figure. It never moved, just stood there looking down into the cellar for the 10 minutes it took for a deputy to arrive. When the patrol car's lights came up the drive, the figure turned and walked away into the scrubland. Not running, just walking, steady and unhurried. The deputy searched the property but didn't find anyone. He told us it was probably a transient, someone passing through who saw the open cellar and was looking for a place to sleep. He suggested we get a lock for the doors. But here's what neither Bate nor I mentioned to the deputy. When the figure turned around, I got a look at it in the police car's headlights, just for a second before it walked away. It didn't have a face, not in the way you'd expect. There was a head and there were features, but they were wrong. The proportions were off. The eyes were too far apart, and where the mouth should have been was just a dark hollow that seemed to go back too far. Bates sold the property 2 months later. She never even bought the goats. Moved to Colorado and works in a brewery now. We don't talk about it, but I went back there once, about a year after she sold. The new owners had filled in the storm cellar completely, poured concrete over the whole thing and planted grass on top. You wouldn't even know it had been there. Except there's a spot right where the doors used to be where nothing grows. Just a rectangle of bare dirt 6 feet by 3 feet, exactly the size of those old wooden doors. And if you stand there at night, you can hear something from underneath. Very faint. A sound like chains dragging across concrete, back and forth, measuring the length of its prison. Story 5. The summer of 2018, I took a job as a rural mail carrier for the route that covered the northwest corner of Thomas County. 60 miles of gravel roads, connecting a dozen farms that were so spread out you could go 15 minutes between mailboxes. It was lonely work, but it paid better than the warehouse job I'd quit, and I liked the feeling of being useful. Most of the people on my route were friendly. They'd wave from their tractors or porches, sometimes flag me down to chat. But there was one mailbox, about 40 miles into my route, where I never saw anyone. It was at the end of a long driveway that disappeared over a hill, serving a property the other carriers just called the Hendricks place, even though I could never find anyone named Hendricks who actually lived there. The mailbox was old and battered, half hanging off its post, and it never had any outgoing mail. Just catalogs and junk mail that I had to deliver. I asked my supervisor about it my 3rd week on the job. "Old farm," she said, not looking up from her computer. "Been abandoned for years. We still deliver there because technically the property still has an active address. Just put the mail in the box and move on." That should have been the end of it. But one afternoon in July, I noticed something that made me slow down. There was a shoe in the ditch beside the mailbox, just one shoe. A woman's sneaker, relatively new, sitting on its side in the grass like it had been carefully placed there. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to figure out why it bothered me. People lost things on rural roads all the time, but something about the way it was positioned felt deliberate. I delivered the mail and drove on. The shoe was still there the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, there were 3 shoes, all different sizes, all positioned carefully in the ditch, all pointing toward the driveway. I mentioned it to one of the farmers on my route, a man named Dick Kavanaugh who'd lived in the area his whole life. "You seeing weird things at the Hendricks place?" He said it like he'd been expecting the question. "Just some shoes in the ditch." He looked at me for a long time. People used to live there. Family called Hendricks, 3 generations of them. They all left in 1987, middle of the night. House has been empty ever since. "Why did they leave?" Didn't say, but Harold Hendricks, the grandfather, he told my father something before they went. Said the land was sick. Said something had gotten into the dirt and wasn't ever leaving. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I decided to drive up the driveway after I finished my route that Friday. I don't know what I was thinking. Curiosity, maybe, or the part of me that hated unsolved questions. The driveway went up and over a hill, then dropped down into a shallow bowl where the farmhouse sat. It was a 2-story structure that had once been white, the paint now peeled away to gray wood. The windows were dark, the porch sagged. In the yard, the grass had grown waist-high, I parked my mail truck and got out. It was hot mid-afternoon, but the air in that bowl felt cold, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. I walked toward the house. I got maybe 20 feet before I saw them. Arranged in the tall grass, forming a wide circle around the house, were hundreds of shoes, all kinds. Work boots, dress shoes, children's sneakers, sandals, house slippers. Some looked new, some looked old. All of them positioned carefully, all facing toward the house. I stood there trying to make sense of it. This had to be some kind of art project. Or maybe the Hendricks family had been hoarders collecting shoes for some reason. But that didn't explain why they were arranged so deliberately or why they all pointed the same direction. That's when I heard the sound from the house. A door opening. The front door swinging inward on hinges that didn't make any noise. I should have run. I knew I should have run. But I was frozen watching that door swing wider and wider until it stood fully open. The interior was dark, too dark for mid-afternoon, and from that darkness something moved. It came out onto the porch and my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, 7 feet, maybe more, and thin in a way that wasn't natural. The limbs were too long, jointed in too many places. It wore clothes or something that had once been clothes, hanging in tatters from a frame that bent and flexed as it moved. The head turned toward me. I still see it when I close my eyes. The face was elongated, stretched, with features that seemed to shift and resettle every few seconds, like a face made of wax, melting and reforming. It took one step off the porch, then another. I ran. I made it to my truck and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. I could hear it behind me, moving through the grass with a sound like wind through wheat. When I finally got the engine started and looked in the rearview mirror, it was standing right behind my truck, just standing there, watching me with eyes that were too large and too dark. I drove. I didn't follow the driveway back. I just drove straight across the field, bouncing over furrows and rocks, not stopping until I hit the main road. I called in sick the next Monday, told my supervisor I had the flu. When I came back Wednesday, I took a different route, one that avoided the Hendricks place entirely. I never delivered there again. I quit that job in September, moved to Garden City and found work at a grocery store. But 6 months after I left, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a shoe. My shoe. The right sneaker from the pair I'd been wearing that day at the Hendricks place. I hadn't even noticed it was missing. And written on the sole in black marker, in handwriting that wasn't mine, was an address. My new address in Garden City. The address I'd never given anyone from Thomas County. As Story 6. The Tillman farm had been producing corn since before Kansas was a state. When Roger Tillman hired me and 3 other guys to help with the harvest in October of 2020, he made a point of telling us that 4 generations of Tillmans, all farming the same section of land 12 miles south of Oberlin. Roger was in his 70s but still worked like he was 40. The other guys were college kids from Kansas State, making beer money. I was 31 and between careers, which is a nice way of saying unemployed. The work was straightforward. Run the combine through the corn rows, fill the grain cart, haul it to the bins. Long hours, but the pay was fair and Roger provided lunch every day. On the 3rd day, we were working the Northeast 40, a section that Roger said he always saved for last. The corn there grew taller than anywhere else on the property, thick stalks that stood 8 feet high in places. Used to be a homestead here, Roger told us during lunch. Before my great-grandfather bought the land, family named Peterson, they all died one winter, scarlet fever according to the records. One of the college kids asked if the house was still standing. Burned down in 1923, Roger said. Nothing left but the foundation stones. That afternoon, I was running the combine through the northeast corner when I found the clearing. It appeared suddenly, a perfect circle in the corn maybe 30 feet across. The stalks around it grew right up to the edge, then stopped. Inside the circle, nothing grew, just bare dirt, hard-packed and smooth. I stopped the combine and radioed Roger. He drove out in his pickup and we stood at the edge of the clearing looking at it. "Hell," Roger said. He took off his cap and rubbed his head. "I was hoping it wasn't back." "Wasn't back." Happens every few years. A circle like this appears somewhere in the corn, usually the northeast 40. Corn won't grow there for a season, sometimes two. What causes it? Roger didn't answer right away. He was looking at something in the center of the clearing. I followed his gaze and saw what he was staring at. There was a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, perfectly round, dropping straight down into darkness. We walked closer. The hole had smooth sides like it had been drilled or dug with precision. I picked up a stone and dropped it in. I counted 5 seconds before I heard it hit bottom. "That's new," Roger said. His voice had changed, gotten quieter. "That wasn't here last time." We decided to call it a day. Roger said he'd contact the county extension office, maybe get someone to come look at it. Some kind of sinkhole, probably. Kansas has a lot of limestone caves and sometimes they collapse. But that night, lying in the bunkhouse Roger provided for his workers, I couldn't sleep. Something about that hole bothered me. The perfect roundness of it. The smooth walls. The way it had appeared in that clearing, like something had opened it from below. Around 2 in the morning, I heard one of the college kids get up and leave the bunkhouse. I figured he was going to the bathroom, but after 10 minutes he hadn't come back. Then I heard the pickup truck start. I got up and looked out the window. I could see the truck's taillights heading toward the northeast 40. I woke the other guys and we drove out there in my car. We found the pickup parked at the edge of the corn, driver's door hanging open, engine still running. The kid, his name was Tyler, I think, or maybe Trevor, was standing at the edge of the clearing, just standing there looking down into the hole. "Hey," I called out. "You okay?" He didn't turn around, didn't react at all. We walked closer. The hole was making a sound now, a low humming that you felt more than heard, vibrating up through the ground into your bones. "Tyler," one of the other guys said. "Come on, man. Let's go back." Tyler took a step toward the hole. We ran forward and grabbed him. He didn't fight us, didn't even seem to notice we were there. His eyes were fixed on the hole and his mouth was moving, whispering something over and over. "They're calling," he was saying. "Don't you hear them calling?" We dragged him back to the pickup and drove straight to Roger's house. Roger called an ambulance and they took Tyler to the hospital in Colby. The doctors said it was some kind of fugue state. He recovered after a few hours, but he didn't remember leaving the bunkhouse or going to the field. Roger paid us all for the full week and said we should probably head home. The harvest could wait. He'd finish it himself. I left the next morning, but before I did, I drove out to the northeast 40 one more time. I'm not sure why. Maybe I wanted to see it in daylight. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it was just a hole in the ground. The clearing was still there, but the hole had changed. It was wider now, maybe 6 feet across, and around its edge, arranged in a careful circle, were bones. Old bones, yellowed and cracked, half buried in the hard dirt. Human bones. I didn't tell Roger. I just left. I heard later that he'd had the whole northeast 40 bulldozed, the topsoil stripped away and replaced with fresh dirt trucked in from another county. He planted soybeans there the next spring. But last year I was scrolling through a farming forum online and saw someone had posted a question about persistent dead zones in their crops. The description matched that clearing exactly. And when I looked at the poster's profile, I saw they were farming land just outside Oberlin, just south of where the old Tillman property used to be. The responses to the post were all practical. Test the soil pH, check for contamination, try crop rotation. But one comment was different. It was from an account with no profile picture and no post history. It just said, "Fill the hole before it gets bigger, and whatever you do, don't listen at night." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.